Neat Nation, hello, happy Monday. I am releasing this on Memorial Day, so happy Memorial Day to those who observe. Today I just wanted to share a little bit and talk a little bit about why I got into bourbon in the first place. Because I feel different now than I did then. Not worse, not better, but different. Like, it's a journey, right? I mean, anytime you get into something, it's an evolution. We're going to talk about that tonight. Before we get into that, one quick thing. If you are a supporter of the channel, a member of Nation, then this bottle might look familiar to you. Come on. Yeah, there we go. This is our most recent barrel pick from Middle West Spirits, facilitated through Sealbox. Barrel strength, 4 grain, wheat and rye bourbon. It's only it's less than 4 years old, but my goodness. I mean, as far as a less than 4 years old bourbon goes, it's extraordinary. I mean, I think in terms of all the barrel picks we've done, this and the Spaniard are kind of the tops. So there may be, at the time of this release, a couple bottles left over on Sealbox, available only to Patreon supporters. Don't sleep on this. If you were ever gonna skip one of our barrel picks, don't skip this. $65, very worth it. Okay. Now let's talk about why I got into bourbon. It's probably going back 7 years or so. 2015, about the time I started drinking bourbon. And it wasn't because I really liked it. Some folks around the office had it, and so periodically, end of a long day, we'd all share a little nip of Bullet, generally. But I was always intrigued by whiskey in general, the process, the aging. So I fell in love with Scotch first. I had always wanted to try that ever since I was a little kid. Kind of fell in love with the idea of Scotch through watching Way Too Much MASH, the TV show, 70s TV show, classic, holds up. But anyway, watching MASH, fell in love with the idea of Scotch, got into Scotch first, even though I kind of started tasting whiskey with bourbon. And kind of chased Scotch for a couple of years there from 2015 to 2017. And it was around that time that I learned what American whiskey and bourbon really could be. When I first got into bourbon, I was captured by the idea that there were products out there on the shelf. There were things that people pursued. There was a bourbon pursuit, if you will, beyond just, everyday stuff. Scotch wasn't that way. With Scotch, the limited releases in Scotch were, $300, $3,000, $5,000. So it was really pay to play with limited releases with the best stuff in Scotch. With bourbon, there was $35 Elmer T. Lee that people wanted and couldn't get. There was this $100 Buffalo Trace Antique Collection stuff that people wanted and couldn't get. At least some people. It seemed like other people really had a knack for acquiring this stuff. And I liked that idea. The idea that everybody wants this stuff. It's out there, but not everybody can get it. When I was in seminary, some of you know I went to seminary. One of the ways that I fundraised, paid for that, was that I would go to estate sales, garage sales, go to Goodwill even, and buy stuff and then resell it. So I'd buy stuff that I knew had a greater value than what was being asked for it, and then flip it. This was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it. It felt like treasure hunting. I watched a lot of the show American Pickers, which is a cheese fest, super campy, but interesting. I enjoyed it. And bourbon, once I got once I graduated and got a job that paid the bills, bourbon was kind of that way too. Not that I really was ever into flipping bourbon. That wasn't really my jam, but I was enamored with the idea that there was maybe a $30 to $40 to $50 bourbon that to people was worth $200 or $300 or $400. The idea that you're finding value, treasure hunting, really. I was into that. And I really, really liked the product. Starting from standard Bullet, which is not great. It's not bad, but it's not great. And then evolving over time, I realized bourbon, particularly higher age stuff, barrel proof stuff, or stuff over 100 proof generally for me, can be absolute fire in the best way. Really enjoy it. It's fantastic. Crave it when I don't have it. I can go without it, but I just love it so much. So then I spent a few years, really 2017 up until winter of 2020, just being a bourbon consumer, a bourbon enthusiast. Relatively, what do you call that, under the radar, I guess. I had an Instagram. I started the Drew P. Whiskey Instagram under a couple different names, but it's been around for quite some time. And I would kind of chronicle my finds and what I tasted periodically. But, it was just a hobby at that point. A lot of fun, but I take everything really, really, really seriously. I don't do anything halfway. If I'm gonna do something, then I do it. And over time, it just got to a point where I was like, I either want to do something with whiskey or I'm just going to dial it back for a little bit. And in the midst of COVID, early COVID, I guess, we're going to call it COVID year one, AAC, or Anno COVIDi. Anyway, I told my wife the other day, it seems like these days we're going to start counting time not based off the year of our Lord, AD. We're going to stop doing that and start talking about the first year of COVID, the second year of COVID, which is a little depressing. But anyway, that's how it sounds, how it feels sometimes. Early COVID, first year of COVID, December 2020-ish, November, December. I was like, you know what? I think I'm going to start making some videos. I have some perspective, I've tasted enough stuff, and I just want to kind of share my thoughts. And most of them at the time were more humorous, less serious, but I did some serious videos early on too. I just wanted to do a mishmash of stuff. I didn't really want to do only formal tastings. There were a lot of channels doing that, a lot of channels that had good access and were doing a good job, and I felt like, you know what, that's probably not the way that I can contribute. So I'm going to do some more list-oriented stuff, maybe some more lifestyle, maybe some topical overviews, maybe some history stuff, and it seemed to resonate with folks really, really well. So that just kind of fueled the pursuit, if you will. I mean, I stopped pretty early on hunting as much. Like, I would still pick up bottles, and of course I'm stoked as the next guy to find a limited release on the shelf, because it, over time, especially as I got deeper into the video game, became more rare to find something rare, I guess. It wasn't too hard for me to find something that I was really proud of, from 2017 into, 2021, but particularly over the last year and a half. My goodness. I mean, the pursuit has become more of a, it's like finding a needle in a haystack. I don't really have any hope of finding allocated stuff without the help of others. The things that were once regular, shelfers for me, those are the things now that it's like, oh yeah, I found an E.H. Taylor small batch. That was not a big thing back in 2017, 2018. That today would be kind of a find. Elijah Craig Barrel Proof, used to be able to get it off the shelf all the dang time. The first one I got was B517, which was the Whiskey Advocate, like Whiskey of the Year. That was my first Elijah Craig Barrel Proof. And then I pretty much had every batch from there through B521, at which point it then became much harder to get. I don't think I've seen a batch on the shelf since B521. It used to be everywhere in Wisconsin, not hard to find really at all. Now it is. It makes it a little bit hard if you make videos about whiskey, if it's hard to procure the whiskeys that people are talking about or want you to, write/record a video about. So these days, there's just not that many products on the shelf that are, of value. Certainly, there are really good value bourbons still, like Rare Breed, basically the entire Wild Turkey line, even Elijah Craig Small Batch, Four Roses 100 Proof Single Barrel. Like, there are products that are still really, really good, but they sort of lack the allure of, hey, not everybody can get this. The treasure hunting is kind of gone. Now, there's still the finding the good profile, like finding the products that are really, really special. Like, that still exists, particularly in doing single barrel picks, which we've been fortunate enough to be able to do formation, but the shelves on the shelf, the shelves in the grocery store, the shelves in the liquor store, they're fairly well picked through at this point. So the thing that initially really got me into bourbon, besides of course the taste profile, is just non-existent anymore. Now there are other things that of course have kind of taken its place. One being the barrel picks, like finding the new stuff like the Middle West spirits that absolutely rocks, the stuff that will compete with the big boys in terms of flavor profile, particularly as the whiskey ages. And then also just being able to dialogue with so many people across the whiskey industry has been very, very entertaining. Like, I understand now, after a year and a half of doing videos and talking with people in the industry, master distillers, brand owners, like just how things work. I was pretty naive. Like, I just didn't understand all of the ins and outs of this industry. And even now, you know, I'm just scratching the surface still, but that's been fun. That said, I do feel like the waters are muddy. I mean, it's like I said, the things that I would have hunted before, I would still hunt today. Still love to score some BTAC, right? I would still love to get a Parker's Heritage. Never had that. The Wild Turkey limited releases, yeah, for sure. And even some of the craft distillery releases that are coming out here, pretty awesome stuff. Like, all that I would still hunt, but it's almost impossible to get, and all that stuff shows up so quickly on the secondary market, which, despite Facebook's efforts to kill it, it's still as big a part of the industry. It's probably bigger part of the industry now than it was when I was first getting involved in bourbon back circa 2017. And honestly, I've come to hate the secondary market. Like, I don't want to rant and rave like a lunatic, but it's just a little bit, like, it takes some of the innocence out of whiskey, which anytime you get into anything, like the first, love at first sight, the first time you get into a particular hobby, particular industry, it's all glorious at that time. It's all pure, it's not stained. So the more you learn about something, the more you learn that everything has a degree of human brokenness attached to it. And bourbon is certainly one of those things. And the secondary market, I think, is sort of the fruit of that. So the prevalence of people buying bottles for the express purpose of flipping them has gone, you know, through the roof. People who do this as a job, you know, that's not uncommon. It's not legal, but it's not uncommon. And then there are a lot of people who are bourbon pursuers, like myself, enthusiasts, who just have more time, who, you know, I know a couple of guys who take time every week and they hit all the stores at the same times when the trucks arrive. And, you know, those guys who have the flexibility to do that tend to actually do pretty well procuring whiskeys, but they're gone so fast. Like, the times in the last year and a half that I've scored have either been because a store I really supported was holding something for me, or one time I walked into a store like right after something really special got put on the shelf 6 months after it had originally been put on the shelf. They had an extra bottle and then put it out later. It was just kind of a freak thing, which was awesome, but extremely uncommon. For the amount of liquor stores I stopped at and continue to stop at, the amount of allocated whiskey that I get is pretty minimal. But there's more and more bourbon on the shelf. There's more and more to keep up with, which means I'd spend more and more money to try more and more things when I really just want, you know, like 4 or 5 or 6 other things. And it's just a lot. And that's kind of how I feel right now. Bourbon is just a lot. Bourbon / American whiskey in general. Every time you're on a blog or every time you're listening to a whiskey tuber talk about something, there's another brand that's sort of making, you know, it's becoming the stuff of hype because we're desperate for something. Like, we can't get the stuff that was previously the stuff of hype. So what's the next thing? What's the next thing? What's the next thing? And I'm just a little bit exhausted by that. Like, I'm a little bit exhausted. Like, Smoke Wagon is good. Bardstown Bourbon Company is good. Starlight is good. Chattanooga is okay. I'll take it 2 directions here. just to kind of wrap this up. And this is a meandering video. This is just sort of a brain dump of my thoughts, not to make any conclusions really, but as an enthusiast who just loves tasting new whiskeys, this is what a time to be alive, really, because there's a lot of new interesting stuff. Like a lot of young distilleries dropping new mash bills. That's pretty cool. A lot of folks experimenting with barrel finishing, which is relatively new in the industry, at least in its acceptance. So that's also pretty cool. And there's still great stuff from the old guys. You can still find Booker's periodically, Knob Creek. If you're working hard, you can find Elijah Craig Barrel Proof, even though it's gotten a lot harder to find. The whole Wild Turkey lineup is fantastic. And then Makers, for the most part, continues to be ignored, but is still very good. So the old guys are still doing great stuff, but craft whiskey is finally coming of age, at least enough to really leave a mark. And again, going back to the single barrel picks, that's where we're finding that some craft whiskeys, the honey barrels in these distilleries are unbelievable. Super, super good, delicious, like this Middle West pick. It is highly encouraging as we look at the future of American whiskey. Now, as a whiskey tuber, though, it's a little, like, the situation's a little bit depressing, because I can tell you about this Middle West pick, and you're like, well, whoop-de-freaking-do, Drew. The yield was 102 bottles. I don't care, because I'm never going to be able to taste it. Or I don't care because it's not this super hyped release that everybody's talking about. So what am I going to talk about? I can just review a whiskey that I've already reviewed, that everybody else has reviewed, which is fine, but it's not really what I want to do. So tonight I figured, well, I should just share, my journey as an enthusiast, because by and large, I feel like, we're looking for community in this. Like, I think that's a principle within Whiskey Tube Verse that has resonated with me, is it's been a place to sort of find some community at a time where we were initially socially distant. Now, the world has opened back up, which has been great. Made a lot of friends through this, which has been fantastic. So, like, creating an environment of empathy that, like, hey, this is kind of a weird deal. And we'll see what happens, right? Like, we'll see where bourbon goes. We'll see how American whiskey evolves. We'll see what ATF finally decides to do about the secondary market, and we'll see how these craft whiskeys continue to age. What I will say is, over the next year, 5 years, I don't expect the allocated whiskeys, the BTACs, the Parkers, etc., to get easier to find. They're not going to be. I think the MSRPs will continue to go up. That's what demand does. That's fine. It's just not quite as cool as it was a few years ago, when you could get these incredible world-class American whiskeys that were just generally undervalued. It's going to be impossible. That's okay. Like, it's not the end of the world. Doesn't mean I'll stop drinking bourbon. It's just kind of a bummer. But I'll look forward to more and more single barrel releases, hopefully doing some more single barrel picks, and then finding stores that crush picks from distilleries that are doing great stuff like Middle West. I think that's where I'm going to be focused moving forward. It's not as sexy from a whiskey tube perspective, but I'm also going to try some other stuff, I think. And try some different forms of content, very experiential, out of my basement, to hopefully offer something a little new to the community. Working on that. Might take a little while to crank out, but all right, nation. I hope you enjoyed the brain dumpage that was that episode. What I'd like to know from you is, what are you jamming on recently? Like, what are you stoked about when you look at bourbon? Like, are you jacked on a particular craft distillery that you find their single barrels to be absolutely... Or are you deep in the Four Roses rabbit hole, which it's easy to get into? Like my friend Brian Bikey at Abandoned Bourbon. I mean, there's some big Four Roses guy. I'm a fan. And like I said, it's easy to get sucked down that rabbit hole. I myself, if there's a big distillery single barrel that I'm most jazzed about right now, it's actually Russell's Reserve. So I hope to be able to land some more of those. Those are attainable when they're released. They don't sell out super fast, and they're really freaking good in the 9 to 10-year-old range. Kentucky bourbon, heck yeah. So holla at your boy. Let me know what you're into, and we might talk about that a little bit more on Thursday's live stream with the aforementioned Brian Bikey of Abandoned Bourbon. Till then, y'all, just keep it chill, keep it tight, keep it safe, and keep it neat. Bye now.